Okay, so this is going to be the final Truman workshop. I know you're just as sad as I am. Actually, I've really enjoyed doing this, guys. Like, this has been fun. This workshop is going to focus on the additional information response, which is actually a really important component of the application. And then also, I'm going to talk about what I consider like the application hairspray, the other final components of the application that in some ways like people do last, but are kind of important just to pay attention to like the nuances of those other questions. So I want to make sure that we hit all those final points. And then as I mentioned, I believe we'll have like at least 15 minutes at the end if people want to hang around and ask me additional questions. So we have that. Okay. So the additional info section. So this is question, 14. The additional info question fulfills an important purpose. You want to think about your application as a holistic, kind of like a holistic puzzle, where each kind of response is a different puzzle piece here. I think about doing the additional info section last because it's important to take stock of, okay, of everything that I've covered in the application, what is something that I haven't touched upon that is extremely important for a reviewer, a reader to understand about me, who I am, why I'm at this point, what has propelled me forward, and help contextualize your candidacy in some way. Because ultimately, like Truman is investing in people who are committed to their particular issue areas and are promised to do amazing work in that issue area, but they're also investing in a person who's a whole person based upon like their experiences that have given them that perspective, have shaped who they are. So the important piece of the puzzle here is it's providing insight that's not found elsewhere. You're not doing yourself any good if you're using this space to reiterate something that appeared like in your leadership response. I'm saying, like, once again, I just want to revisit that kind of experience and tell you a little bit more about like how that leadership experience is fulfilling me. That's not doing anything for you. It's not providing, giving the reader any additional insight. The additional info section is providing a window into who you are. So it's important to be you and be authentic. Artifice, it's pretty easy to spot artifice. We want to read something that is written in your kind of own voice, that is you kind of reflecting on your experiences and why you're here. So this leads into show and don't tell. It's not compelling to just have a series of statements about assuring the committee that you are a leader, that you are passionate, that you take initiative, that you will make the most out of this experience. That does not actually provide anything. You would be better off, and actually, if there's one thing I'm like, actually, Lauren and I joke about, we're really tired of seeing in applications, and it's not against you if you do this, but this is important to be like self-reflective. When people spend a lot of time saying how passionate they are about things, it's like, you would be so much better off using that space to talk about what is informed, like your interest in that issue, than simply telling me that you're passionate. Because simply telling me you're passionate doesn't do anything. And I'll already get the sense of your passion with the kind of like the specificity and clarity that you are talking about kind of like your issue area and what you want to do. So avoid telling the reader things. Always try and help the reader understand why you're here or how you're here or what has informed kind of like why you're here. That gets into avoid cliches, and then add details. So like think about like, where is the story here? I always think about like when you read, let's say you're reading a novel that says like, oh yes, Laura was born in Colorado. I'm like, okay. If the novel says like, I don't know, I'm using myself because I wasn't born in a small town, but say like, okay, I was born in a small town. So Laura was born in a small town in Colorado. It's like, okay, that's nice. But then if I said, I was born in, I don't know, like Sterling, Colorado, population 3,000, where I knew every single one of my neighbors, where we like went to community functions together. Like that suddenly becomes like a lot more resonant in my mind as something that I, as a reader, would remember. I'd remember someone, oh, who's from Sterling, Colorado, than someone who's just saying like, I'm from a small town. So think about like, where is the story and what you're telling someone? And this advice applies to anything else that you might be writing as a personal statement for other kinds of opportunities. Like find that story, think about where is there that kind of scene that you can add detail to, because that detail is what someone remembers. Okay. So what to write about? So there's different approaches to the additional information section, and there's not one kind of right approach here is something that I want to emphasize. Some choose to write about an aspect of their personal or family background. And this might be really powerful and might be really important for the reader to know, to help us understand, like perhaps your neighborhood or your kind of community, and that experience, how that shaped your interest in the kind of issue that you've identified. So for instance, and I've talked about, like, use this as an example before. For instance, if you were, came from a community that was in a food desert, and like the closest, like the only grocery stores that your family was able to go to were like perhaps like a 7-Eleven. And that fundamentally shaped your perspective to like nutrition and access and like kind of food security. That might be something to share to help us understand, like that's ultimately what's like propelled you to this moment. Or if there's something about kind of like your like cultural background or like, I don't know, religious background that has informed kind of like your issue area, that could be something important to share too. So you could either like help us understand like personal family context that has affected why you're here and how you've gotten to this point, or perhaps you could use this as an opportunity to talk about another formative experience that you didn't have space to talk about elsewhere. Because you only really were given like the leadership and public service kind of responses as places to talk about what has been meaningful for you, where you felt like you've contributed. And perhaps there's another experience from another activity, another kind of internship that was also really informative, changed your perspective. And this might be the place to offer that for the reader, because they wouldn't get that elsewhere. Now I have in here, I want to make a note about adversity, because I think sometimes there's a danger with applications of thinking about like, really, it's just like who has the most hardship. And I want to emphasize that that is not the case. Like certainly hardship, if it has affected you and affected why you are interested in the issues that you're interested in, certainly there's a potentially place for this. But this is not to say I'm going to like try and find hardship because somehow that's going to win me more points with the reader. That is like not at all this. That's not at all the case, and I want to emphasize that. I also think sometimes there's a danger with these kinds of things where people feel like they need to exploit their narratives. So perhaps there's kind of like hardship in their past and they feel like they need to, because perhaps like, you know, with applications to like college or something like that, like they felt like they had to exploit kind of like their hardship or suffering for the sake of the committee. I want to be careful and say, you should never feel like you need to exploit anything about your background. You get to choose what you want to share and what you are comfortable sharing. If it is not something you are comfortable sharing, don't write about it. If it is something that you are comfortable sharing because you think it's important for the committee to know, and it fundamentally would help someone understand why you're here, why you're committed to particular issues, what has affected your ability to like do certain things, and that's like on your own terms, then share it. But like, I want to emphasize your power comes from choosing what and how you share something. So if what you want to share in this additional information section does relate to some kind of hardship, I want that to be something that you take away from this discussion. Okay. So I'm going to show you guys and like actually go through a series of additional information responses. And I want us to reflect on whether they resonate for you. Now, there's no like right or wrong answer here. I don't want to phrase this in terms, and like Truman actually does have effective and ineffective responses listed on their website with regards to the additional information section. But I want you to think when you see these responses in terms of, if you are a reader of the applications, like you're the application reader, and you saw this response, would this be something that you felt gave you good insight into the reader? So this is not like there's a right or wrong answer here. It's kind of just like, do you think that this adds value in some way to your understanding of the person? So we have the first one here. Surrounded by young, older, wise, and ambitious change makers, I will add my voice as we take an oath to improve society. I've never in my life been so excited to wake up to go to class every morning, because every day I learn something new from the conversations. Academically, I've already come so far. My Georgetown education is truly a waking dream, something I never thought possible. I feel in my heart this organization will provide the mentorship, advice, and exposure I need to grow as a student in person. Many factors have contributed to the inspiration I feel and communicate. Kids I knew left school to sell drugs or join that meant to be gangs. That same school had no heat or air conditioning, and sometimes the cafeteria ran out of food. Georgetown University is doing more than providing a quality education. It is transforming a deep love for my background and experience growing up that I didn't know how to embrace. I am a fighter. I never give up. I am full of energy, ideas, and care. I'm a leader because I know how to work in a team. I want to learn, I want to grow, and that is why I know the time I'm giving to you will benefit my future. I also feel confident enough to say that I'll be able to contribute to your greater cause. I have a heart full of energy, loyalty, and faith. In conclusion, I am passionate about public service, and this opportunity would mean the world to me. Okay. Thoughts? Once again, there's no right or wrong answers here. I'm just curious, like how you respond to this response. If there's something that struck you, that you wanted to know more about, like let's talk this through. If this was our like committee of readers right now, what would be like kind of your thoughts on this response?
I thought it was kind of cliche in a lot of places. It didn't really strike me as very specific. Like it seemed like they mentioned a lot of things that could have been really good to emphasize, that then they just didn't emphasize it, and they kind of went the way of just cliches about being, strong and a fighter or something like that.
Okay, so there's like a lot of telling happening. Okay. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Yeah, similarly, it seems like they had some good opportunities, like when they started talking briefly about like their school experience that was like not having heat or air conditioning and different details like that. Like if they had maybe chosen that and really expanded on it more, that could have been, I think, more revealing, but instead they only dedicated a couple sentences to it. So I think I was like left wanting more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like kind of like the hints of things about their background that have fundamentally shaped them, but we're not perhaps like getting enough detail to like know actually what that context was in order to appreciate how that's kind of informed them. Yeah. Or like what to make sense of it, like what perhaps like how to interpret the kind of, hints that we're getting. Anything else? Okay. I mean, I think like both Dalton and Sarah, like thank you for participating. I think like what you shared is like completely, I mean, that's how I respond to thinking about kind of like the generalities, a lot of like telling rather than showing. I also think like one of the metrics here is like if anyone else could say the same thing, is this like doing anything for you? So things about I'm a fighter, I am full of energy, ideas, and care. I'm a leader. I want to learn. I want to grow. I would think that probably most people applying to Truman like would consider themselves full of energy and like want to grow and like believe that they're contributing to some greater cause. So like I think one of the tests that I would use with your own materials, and actually like anything in the application, is if you read one of your statements and think, wow, that could have like easily appeared in someone else's application, either cutting it or using it as an opportunity to get more specific. And also perhaps thinking, I mean, now I forget if Sarah, I think Sarah, you brought it up, like the mentions about like actually what we're getting a little bit more when we're getting a little bit more about kind of like the background. Is that something that is like really important to share? And if so, like doing justice to that information so that the reader walks away with a better appreciation of like why you're sharing it. Because you can't expect I guess I should say, you are curating interpreting your experiences for the reader so that they know what to take away from it. You don't want to kind of just like throw things at the wall and hope that the reader is able to make sense of it in a way that you want them to make sense of it, if that makes sense. That was a lot of senses. Okay. I guess we will move on to the next one. Okay. So on afternoons in the Hart Senate office building, I could be found without fail in the mailroom. In Senator Feinstein's office, we received hundreds, sometimes thousands of pieces of mail each morning and afternoon. Letters received responses, postcards were counted and recycled. I sorted them into categories, tallying the numbers of each so that the senator would know what her constituents found most pressing and how they wanted her to proceed. Some were funny, a third grader asking for cash so he could visit Washington, D.C. after 4 unpaid internships. His unmet desire for money from the government resonated with me. Some required significant effort, a hand-painted, meticulously shaded image of certain parts of the human anatomy. I respected the artistry as much as the message. Some attached photos of their children or had the children do the writing. A good move, I thought, as my future children will probably write to their senators before they can ride a bike. Some were from artists, doctors, and scientists worried for the National Endowment for the Arts, the Affordable Care Act, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Imagine how many postcards with polar bears on them I saw this year. And some were absolutely heartbreaking. A detailed, explicit account of a sexual assault. The author could have been anyone. I felt like I knew her. I think we all do. There in the mailroom, I began to understand how much faith these constituents put in their public services to help them, and how much faith the people of California were unwittingly putting in me, the 19-year-old from New Jersey, to communicate their grievances properly before dooming them to the ever-overflowing recycling bin. As a civil rights lawyer, I want to represent individuals like those who wrote to the senator, but who were really writing to me all along, to channel their individual pain, experience, and hope into action, to make their faith in their public servants mean something. I see some smiles. Like I like see some people smiling here. Like what are the smiles, or like what do we think? What do we think?
I can say as somebody who I also worked on the Hill and sorted through lots of mail, a lot of hate mail, but this very much resonated with me. I like the specifics and the imagery, and I like how she connected it. Maybe this is just my qualm, but I feel like at the end I lost it a bit. I wasn't sure. Maybe like I didn't see that connection, but I'm glad that she made it. Or he. Sorry, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, like, why did you feel like you left it? Like, what was kind of like the like you were so invested in the end, you're kind of like Is that kind of like, is that reflective?
Yeah, I think that maybe she just didn't, or he didn't need to. It didn't need, I might be wrong with how these are written.
There's no right or wrong answer.
Yeah, I don't think that they needed to say like, oh, and this is experience is what, like how this motivated me to public service. I think that just ending it with like, this is how much I learned and what I appreciated would have been enough for me personally. And I loved the parentheses, kind of like the authentic thought as a response to each one, like the back and forth. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, I think some of you were smiling when we got to the parentheses, because like it's almost like this goes to like the kind of like personal voice thing. Like it's almost like someone was like telling you about like the polar bears, or like telling you about like, oh yeah, my children are gonna be able to write to their senators before they ride a bike. Like it's almost like your insight into someone's mind, which is like, it feels authentic, even if perhaps it's like not necessarily like talking about them. So it's like, that's like thinking about like, how do you interpret something for the reader where they know what you're kind of like taking away from it is interesting. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Anybody else?
Yeah, I found myself kind of laughing at it a little bit, and I was wondering for this question and really all the questions, like to what degree should we be comfortable with kind of like cracking jokes and making it a little more like laid back and more relatable, or should we stick in the other questions maybe to being more professional, and then this one could be more laid back?
I think it's like, I think the critical question to ask here is like, why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you think like that's like someone's going to think it's cute? Like, or are you doing it because like it's important to know how you were interpreting something? Like you were interpreting someone for that, and like that's in your voice and you're adding humor because that's how you're interpreting it. I think there's a difference. Like I would be careful of like throwing in jokes because you think that like you're winning points with the reader's gonna be like, ha, 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 like you're so funny. Or is it like done in a way of like, this is actually how I'm thinking through something? So I think that there's a difference there. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this one? I'm just curious, like, how do people, like, did people think like this was like an effective response? Like Adam, you seem like you were like generally like on board, and then we're like, oh, at the end, yeah, okay.
I'm confused. Like, I feel like this could be a really good leadership response almost, but I'm confused as to like what additional information, other than like showing that they're a very empathetic, thoughtful, funny, and a good writer, I think. I'm just, yeah, I guess I'm wondering more about the purpose of the question when I read this response and less about this response. Like, I'm wondering what I should be saying.
Yeah. I mean, and so I wanted to include this response because I think and this is kind of why I wanted to mention like the different ways of approaching this response from the beginning. Like some people go super personal, and actually that's probably like most people's tactic is to go like personal background. I wanted to show an example of one that was about an additional experience that didn't appear elsewhere in the application. Now, this person was invited to interview, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's like a perfect response. And so that's like why I wanted to invite people to reflect on like how you responded, because I think the more that you're able to like kind of read your own response and think like, how would I take that, or like have a friend read it or something, how would you respond to that? Is that accomplishing what you wanted to respond, or is it distracting someone and making them like ask additional questions? So I think it's important to like, Adam, like when you responded the way you did, to be like, why is it that I was responding the way that I did? And perhaps like at the end, it went from, and maybe I'm like kind of interpreting what you're saying in the wrong way, but went from like, you know, insight into how this person is kind of like processing the kind of relationships in some ways with the constituents that are writing, and then it goes to more perhaps like more of a professional like mission statement. Maybe that's kind of like what you were responding to. So maybe we lost a little bit kind of like the authenticity there. But yeah, I wanted to show you like a different example of something that I think is kind of like quirky, detailed, like is about an experience, so not necessarily about the person, but is about how that person's relating to that experience. And I think in a way that Adam, as you mentioned, was like still providing insight into like their empathy and their kind of like connection to the work, and perhaps another insight into like why this work is so meaningful for them. Okay. Any other thoughts on that one before we move on? I also just like love, I mean, this is just me. I love like the kind of notion of like my future children will probably write to their centers before they can ride a bike. I think it just like says something about the person. Okay. Final one. Our society taught me that I was never supposed to go to a top university like Georgetown University, apply to become a Truman Scholar, or pursue any of the opportunities I have. It taught me those opportunities were supposed to be for the children of wealthy, educated, and connected families and not for people like me. I was born and raised in a working class family in rural Alabama, and I'm the first person in my family to go to college. My mother, who primarily raised me, graduated high school and worked odd jobs as a waitress, factory worker, and cashier, while my father, who was mostly absent, dropped out of school in the 9th grade and went to work as a sandblaster in the shipyards. I was homeschooled after the 4th grade, but dropped out before high school. With support from family, friends, and hard work, I eventually went on to earn my GED, graduate summa cum laude from community college, and earned a full scholarship to transfer to Georgetown University. My experiences growing up made me interested in learning more about how public policy affects our day-to-day lives, and led me to choose Georgetown University because of its location in the nation's capital, its commitment to public service, and its mission to educate the next generation of public servants. My struggles enabled me to empathize with the struggles of others different from my own, and have motivated me to empower those like me who aren't, quote, supposed to lead. And I should mention this person has openly shared this kind of aspect of their background, so I'm not doing anything without this person's kind of like approval. So just wanted to add that kind of caveat. Thoughts on this one?
I think that it was powerful that they used the opportunity to say something, like I guess from a personal narrative, whereas other things like you're saying something about yourself, but you're saying it by what you did. And so I thought it was well written.
Mm-hmm. Like speaking to like how one's context, I think perhaps like both provides insight into like the challenges that they had to navigate to get to this point, but also influence the kind of like issues that they're kind of committed to thinking about. Yeah.
Also, was going to say, I also liked how they identified what they personally experienced versus what their parents experienced, because kind of how you mentioned earlier, like it's not about like who like had the least amount of food in the desert or what have you. Like your other people's struggles may not be your own, and you don't have to exaggerate your experiences, but she just stated them. Like she kind of stood in her own truth and was like, here's how this all connects in the bridge of life without having to kind of have this exploitation of herself, or like I died of hunger kind of thing, I guess. And I think that in itself, just being like showing up in the true, genuine way, was the most powerful thing she could have done.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really great that you like phrased it in the way that you did, like stood in one's own truth, like getting a sense of walking away from this, like this person embraces like this background, this is like fundamentally who they are, and wants to kind of like lay it out in a way that's not kind of like exploiting their own story, but like it's important for one to know. I also got like it's relatable, like I think like this like also speaking to kind of authenticity. We're like walking away with a perhaps a really good sense of yeah, as I said, like who this person is, standing in their own truth, like and this is what's informed why they're here. I think it's really powerful, this kind of notion about like our society taught me that I was, quote, never supposed to go to a top university like Georgetown, and that like has motivated me to empower those like me who weren't supposed to lead. Like it's almost a way of saying, like, you know, when I earlier said you don't need to say that you're passionate or committed, because it's a way of saying like this person's super committed and motivated in a powerful way that's not just like coming out and telling us that. So this is obviously an example of including like the personal kind of like family context that has like is the background for everything that kind of followed from that. So chose like 3 examples, 2 of these, this one, both were invited to interview. Of course, that doesn't mean like a response is perfect, but gives you a sense perhaps of something like some things that resonated with the readers where they wanted to get to know this person and have a conversation with them. This one was not invited to interview, I think for some of the reasons that others pointed out, that we're not necessarily learning anything particular about this individual. We don't know what to walk away from this response with. There are perhaps things about this that might characterize other applicants to this kind of opportunity. Okay. And I would mention, related to this like last conversation, that if you are including like details about like family members, because that like has been like really formative to who you are, make sure that you're helping us understand how that's affected you and not just like telling us a story of like your grandmother or grandfather. Like I think sometimes there's a tendency to be like, my grandfather like fought in World War II and like did the sacrifice and you know, lay that all out there where like the person is lost within that. If you are talking about a family member or family members who've been important to you, helping us understand what we should be doing with that information in terms of like how we should better understand you from that, if that makes sense. So just make sure that you are not losing yourself within this response, because this response is meant to be kind of like about you, or like, you know, provide that additional insight into you. Okay. As I mentioned, like Truman does have list like satisfactory and unsatisfactory responses on their website, so you can check those out. And like, as you know, Truman always has kind of like the annotations about why they thought something was particularly satisfactory or unsatisfactory. So you can read more examples there. Obviously, these ones I just showed you are not there. So just getting additional insight. Okay, that's. Oh yeah, I want to mention this too. Just a final reminder, and I mentioned this last time, but I want to continue to reiterate it, that the application is a cohesive whole and not a series of like interesting and disjointed anecdotes. So trying to like, and this is why I think of like puzzle pieces, because I think with the puzzle pieces, it's helpful to think about like, how is this puzzle piece in service of kind of like the larger like argument that I'm making about kind of like my candidacy, my issue, and like why I want to be committed to it. So not that everything has to be exactly like topically related to your issue area, but thinking about how can you like always like thread things back to help us understand perhaps like how it's given you like a certain perspective or mindset that is relevant to kind of like doing what you want to do in the future. So cohesion is important. Any last things about, I think after this I move on to the other application, yeah. Any last things about additional information that I can clarify or answer? Yeah, Matt.
Just to restate what you said in the my own words just so I understand it. So whatever we say in the additional information, it should be clear. So like the example that Adam was saying, like the ending where the writer was saying, I want to be a lawyer. We should have somewhere in there that says, I want to enter your future.
Good question. I'm glad I can clarify that. So no, it's not like that person, I think like Adam like thought that seemed a little bit kind of like artificial to be at the end, be like this like super kind of like quirky, like, you know, personal insight, then end up with like, and that's why I want to be a civil rights lawyer. But like still we know, like taking that out, we still know that like this person who's committed to working actually for like want to become a civil rights lawyer. I mean, like knowing that, we understand like why they want to become a civil rights lawyer without necessarily them having to tell us that, because they are moved by like these needs about like how these kinds of policies are affecting them and affecting their kind of like children. And so we get a sense of like what personally is kind of like that draw for them, which helps us kind of understand the large picture. When I mean cohesive, I mean that, and actually this is something to think about as I talk about the rest of the application, like select courses. I mean that like if you use the additional information section to tell me about like skydiving, like you like skydiving, I would be like, why am I learning about this? I mean, like, I would want to know like what is about like this kind of anecdote experience gives me some insight that helps me better appreciate your candidacy in some way. So in that way, I mean, take things like as a kind of cohesive whole. Because if your whole thing was like related to like kind of like educational like equity, and then like at the additional information section, it was about like how like you challenge yourself to go skydiving and like you love skydiving and like you're becoming certified in skydiving. Like perhaps it's like giving me a different insight, but I might be like, oh, I would like love to have known like a little bit more about like what was the context that perhaps drew you to become interested in kind of like issues pertaining to like educational equity. That's what kind of I mean when like cohesion. And like thinking about like how the different pieces perhaps give me a better understanding of who you are as it relates to kind of like your commitment and kind of like interest area. Does that help? Okay. I mean, actually someone previously has talked about getting their pilot's license, and that was kind of like interesting and like ended up somewhat being like related. I forget exactly how they kind of related it. So like there could be opportunity to talk about like hobbies. I'm not like kind of saying that's like off the table. But I would just think about like what is going to be the most effective in terms of giving the reader insight that they need into your like who you are and your candidacy. Okay. Okie dokie. So now we have the select courses question, which kind of seems like perhaps like as this random question that's thrown in there, like what are the 3 courses that have, I think I forget how the question is phrased, but what are the three courses that have been most important in preparation for your career? I took out the quotes here. Okay. So this is also where I want to mention, like, I guess the cohesion thing comes up more importantly here. Because the emphasis is in preparation for your career. So if you were doing, as I said, like educational equity issues or like, you know, healthcare equity or something like that. And one of the courses you chose to focus on was like Spanish for beginners. And you're just like, oh, like this class was fun because we did like games. I'd be like, what? Like, how is that related? But if you're like Spanish for beginners, because in working kind of like healthcare equity, important to understand like perhaps like the needs of different populations, and language is one of the ways of like most connecting with people and building trust that's critical to like, you know, healthcare. Then I have a better appreciation. So making sure you're helping us understand like why that course as it relates to strengthening your interest in your issue area or giving you skills that's going to be relevant to kind of your career. So emphasis on the courses that have shaped, informed, or challenged your perspective, interests, or skills as they relate to your issue area. It could also be a course that's completely complicated or upended your understanding of something too. That can be interesting. But is somewhat related to helping us understand how you've come to grapple with your issue area or be further motivated to work on your issue area, or as I said, gain skills that are relevant to your issue area. not just the course title. So it's not going to be helpful if you say healthcare in America, because it gave me an understanding of healthcare in America. I'm like, well, that's just like a waste of like your very little space that you already had. Like, so think about what is something that you can give me that's not already understood by the course title itself. And obviously keeping it crisp, concise, and specific. You do not have a lot of space to work with for each of these kinds of courses. I think it like ends up being like 1, maybe 2 lines for each of the 3 courses. So you really want to think about like, how can you distill this down to the most important point about that course? It's not like you have to do an exhaustive list about everything you learned. Okay, so I have examples here. So this is, I've shown this candidate's application materials before, but this is the person who was interested in refugee integration, specifically in urban settings, as you may remember. So the 3 courses are in education development in the Middle East and North Africa region. I worked with the nonprofit QuestScope to build an impact assessment of its education program for out-of-school youth in Jordan, gaining an appreciation of both the positive outcomes and limitations of NGO work. So great. So understanding both the opportunities, limitations, and related to NGO work, because NGO work was going to be one component of things that they were going to be engaging with in the future. Then we have propaganda and social exclusion, helped me to better recognize undercurrents of divisiveness in the public sphere. I explored the politics of scapegoating and structural exclusion and learned how to work towards confronting their power in my career, especially in kind of like a charged issue regarding like refugee integration, when you're confronting perhaps like political currents and the climate. That seemed like particularly important. And then geographic information systems transformed my interest in urbanization to a fascination for urban policy and planning. My project on mapping displacement in the Middle East sharpened my focus on the intersection of geography and global migration. So as I said, like it can also be about skills. So getting like GIS training can be relevant when you're using that data to better like track and predict displacement and develop policy around it. Okay. That's all I have about courses. Oh, Matt, yes.
If we have a class that is just either really long in name, are we able to shorten it if it would be obvious from our transcript, or no?
Can you give me like an example?
Yes, Title IX for a new generation. Several characters, several words, probably in the realm of education development, but like.
That's not too long. Title IX for new generation?
6 words for one class. I'm just saying.
I can definitely beat you on that one. I have like a 9
Same.
word. Yeah.
I'm just
a very long one.
That's why I'm asking.
I don't think you could shorten that. Like you can't really abbreviate that one. And like I actually don't think like that's terribly long. Like I feel like that's just as long as like Title IX new generation. I'd have to like write it up. I feel like that's the same amount of space as like education development and MENA. I think that's okay. Like that's like not a great response, but like I think you can do it. You could potentially abbreviate if it was like, I mean, like if it's United States, obviously you abbreviate to like US, but like don't try and like cut corners with regards to like trying to abbreviate words that aren't traditionally abbreviated, is what I would say. And ultimately, like you want to think about this like a tweet. Like that's actually was like an interview question at one point. Like in a tweet, like in the length of a tweet, tell me like the, main point of this book. So like, it's something like a practice, like doing like, how do you concisely in one sentence, like give us like the takeaway. So yes, only abbreviate if that makes sense to abbreviate. Like I wouldn't have done like GIS as like this course title. We need to like actually understand what the course is. Okay. Any other questions relating to the courses? I know that wasn't a very like satisfying response to that question. Anybody else on the courses? Okay, we will move on. Okay, so now we have like the questions 1 through 6. So these are the biographical questions about like, your governmental activities, like campus activities. So first of all, you want to be accurate. I think it just like in the application that I sent around, I think it just says like dates. You want to include months because there's a huge difference between like if you wrote like 2017 to 2018, that could either mean that you were doing something from January 2017 to December of 2018, which would be like what, almost 24 months, or that could mean like December 2017 to January 2018, which is 2 months. So months are really important. You can then write to like present if it's still ongoing. I know there have been a couple questions related to the fact that people, like, due to COVID, had things lined up that have been delayed. You could indicate that something is going to be starting in like January of 2021. You could say like, you know, starting January 2021 to whatever. So that would be a possibility if something is kind of like lined up certainly for the future. Also using descriptive titles. So like in those short responses, they ask about like activity and then they ask about role. So like for instance, activity might be like 1DC, organization in DC working for like kind of community empowerment, and perhaps the role there was like community outreach intern, or like activity is the Hoya at Georgetown University, role contributing opinion writer. So trying to be as descriptive as possible to give us a sense. Like it might be if something like is a really quirky organization that no one's really going to know, you potentially could add in like a little like contextual detail about like in parentheses like environmental nonprofit or something that helps a reader immediately get a sense of what you're talking about, or like type of work, administrative assistant, employer, Georgetown University, office of the president. I can pull this up so you guys can see the application too. And then under the awards and honors section, I mentioned this before, but you want to avoid high school awards and honors unless we're talking about like significant honors, like a campus-wide award, or perhaps you were like the valedictorian or salutatorian. Is it salutatorian? Like that might be like worthy of including, but like I wouldn't go back to like freshman year of high school and talking about like, I don't know, I don't even have a word, like, you know, the best oral presentation in your Spanish class in freshman year of high school, like that's not going to help you. Question, if like the name or title is too long, can it take the place of 2 rows? Yes, that's fine. I should mention like too that like this is not like, you want the application that you're turning in for the internal deadline to be as polished as possible to give the selection committee, which I am not on, just once again to reiterate, I'm not the one reviewing your applications, to give that committee as good of a sense of your candidacy. But if you are invited to move forward, you will be working with me for like 2 more months. So there's a lot that can happen afterwards. Like, you know, if you're slightly unsure about like how to phrase something, that's like certainly something that would be worked out in the future. So kind of like do your best with regards to like kind of the descriptive titles or the presentation of the activities, but like don't get like too kind of caught up in how it's being presented. And then also for the awards and honors, like you would list like the award and then in parentheses put the year, because I think that's really important context for a reader to understand. Okay. And also to mention, and I think this is something that's worried people in the past, that, you know, there are the different sections about like campus activities, like public service activities, or like, you know, employment. And someone might say like, oh, I have nothing to include under this one section, but I have like 5 things to include under this other section. Like that is fine. Your application is read holistically. They're not just like looking at one section and being like, oh shoot, like you only had one thing there, like can't evaluate the rest of your application. Like that's not the case. They're looking at your application holistically, saying like, holistically, what have you done and what have you achieved, kind of like where are you at. So I wouldn't get too worked up if like you have 5 things in one section and 1 thing in one section. Like that's not going to be a big deal. And obviously for individuals who had to like work during like college, like seeing that and seeing like kind of the employment that you had to have, that like you had to devote like 20 hours a week to like working jobs and thus were like less able to participate in perhaps like internships or something like that. Once again, the committee is like taking all that into consideration in terms of like how they are understanding your candidacy. So just to kind of take reassurance from that. Okay. Then there's this question about the Washington Summer Institute that comes like on the first page, like immediately after kind of like you list like major, GPA, that kind of stuff. And it asks, I think it's phrased like, will you apply for the Washington Summer Institute? And people are like, what the heck is the Washington Summer Institute? I thought I was applying to the Truman Scholarship. What is this? Like the Washington Summer Institute. Okay. The Washington Summer Institute is an opportunity for those who receive the Truman Scholarship to take an internship in DC after graduation that is the Truman Foundation helps to organize. that is at a nonprofit or governmental agency that would be in line with kind of your issue area. This Summer Institute's like pretty great because not only are you getting a kind of like topically related internship that's related to your interests, but you're also benefiting from the opportunity to continue to like participate in the Truman Network. They have seminars and kind of like workshops that happen throughout that summer. So it's a really great experience. And in almost every single case, you would want to say like, yes. Yes, you would apply to the Washington Summer Institute. You wouldn't want to say like no unless like you're absolutely certain because of like commitments, maybe like ROTC or something, that like that summer would be devoted to like something else. In which case you would say like no because of like that commissioning or something. So like you would provide context with regards to what that is. But everybody else probably would say like yes, and then you would want to provide kind of like example of like a kind of like office that you'd be particularly interested in working in, or maybe like a nonprofit agency that would allow you to gain additional experience in your issue area. So like it's important to think what additional experience would be valuable as you gear up for the next postgraduate steps. Here's an example that I included here about, I would be interested in addressing local gender and civil rights policy issues in the Civil Rights Division of the DC Attorney General's Office or the Mayor's Office on Women's Policy. I hope to continue to better understand the intricacies of local government and gain local civil rights policy insight while expanding my scope to a municipality beyond those in which I previously worked. While I focused on civil rights issues from a policy standpoint in my previous work, I would like to work closely with legal staff to develop my perspective on how the law can be used to confront civil rights violations and create real change in individuals' lives. So just like need to know, like this is kind of pretty short, this is like what, 4 sentences, just like where you would ideally like to work. Once again, you don't have to like think about arranging this or the practicality of this. This is kind of like just like what appeals to you, why you would like to work there, and how you envision it kind of like fitting in terms of like how you're thinking about your kind of training and postgraduate steps. So yes, like this is a great opportunity. You'd want to say like yes to this response. Okay. Any questions about those details about the application? I want to move into briefly talking about resume advice, but want to make sure I've answered all of the actual application questions first. Any other remaining questions about that?
Oh, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry if this was asked before, but for the one that says lists the secondary school from which you graduated and then blah, 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 nominating institution, what is meant by nominating institution?
That's Georgetown.
That's just Georgetown. Okay.
Yeah, because this application is basically the same application that you would be submitting if you were to be one of Georgetown's nominees. So yeah, there are questions in there that seem a little bit silly for the internal deadline purpose. But yes, Georgetown University would be your nominating institution. Also, let me just like, do I have the application here somewhere? Yes, I did. I did pull it up ahead of time. So let me, I'm just going to go to the application really quickly just to show you guys. The other thing I would mention, because it's also confusing, is that, yeah, this would be Georgetown. And then here, the graduate degree sought, obviously, like if you're doing a JD or something, the concentration, I think this confuses people, the concentration relates to the graduate degree. So if it was like, if you were saying you wanted to go a JD and you wanted to do civil rights law, then the concentration would be civil rights law. Or if it was like MPA, it might be like nonprofit management or something. So the concentration is pertaining to the graduate program. And then, yeah, the Washington Summer Institute question. And yeah, as I said, dates attended always include months. And also keep in mind, it's asking for you to list things in descending order of significance, which means that you want to list the most important thing at the top. Okay. Anything else about the application itself? Okay. Go back to the, oh, where's that? What did I do with it? Oh goodness. Where is my screen? Okay. Resume. So we ask you just a little bit about why we ask you to include a resume in the internal application. You actually don't submit a resume as part of the final external application if you were selected as a nominee, but we want the resume for the internal application because the committee wants to have the most insight into your candidacy, and it might be at this point in time where perhaps like some of the things that would be most important to include that you don't yet, you yourself being too much immersed in it, excuse me, like haven't yet like thought through. And so like the committee wants to make sure that they have like that most, like that greatest insight in your candidacy, because perhaps like that might be something they would encourage you to kind of like flesh out elsewhere in the application. So the resume is kind of providing that more like kind of like larger picture. And resumes for fellowships are a curation of your experiences, of you kind of drawing out what's been most significant to help the reader understand your candidacy. So it's another piece of the application that's making your argument for your candidacy, kind of like why you're at this point where you want to go. And it's helping like the readers understand like demonstrated commitment, like how you previously engaged, telling your story. It's you contextualizing and framing that experience and drawing attention to what's particularly important. So just like briefly, I think when people hear resumes, they think about like kind of like with a I want to say, I don't know if it's stereotypical, but like kind of stereotypical organization where it's like a mission statement and then like education, professional experience, additional information. Well, you are not contractually obliged to use those kinds of categories. I mean, like you want to obviously have the education category, but you want to think about like, what is the opportunity that you're applying to, looking for, and valuing? Because you might group your experiences around thematic categories that reflect the selection criteria. So in Truman's case, which places a huge emphasis on like leadership, you might have a leadership section. Or you might have like, if you've done like had policy internships to date, you might have like a policy experience section. So that's not to say you necessarily would, but if you think like your candidacy is really strong in particular areas, you might think about like grouping experiences accordingly. Or if you've like done a lot of undergraduate research and that's something you want to highlight, you could have a research section. So like a thematic heading like leadership or research might be something that we'd use. Now, Georgetown College Career Center's website has sample resumes. I would strongly encourage you to check that out if you haven't already, because they also have resume samples for different types of experiences, and it will be valuable to see how to best organize your resume. I've seen a lot of badly organized resumes. That's not a judgment on the person by any means, but I think it's oftentimes because people don't yet have the models of how to like best format and structure their experiences. So I would strongly encourage you to check out those samples. They are there for a reason. And just a couple like do's and don'ts based upon our experience of seeing resumes for fellowships. It's important to be concise. Like in general, you don't want to have more than 3 bullet points for an experience, and being selective and strategic about what you include. Because if you were choosing to include all the things that you did in your kind of like internship on the Hill, then like perhaps like the most important aspects of your experiences get lost in the mix. So like if you were an intern on the Hill and you were participating in contributing to like policy briefs, but then you also like ordered like post-it notes, like I don't need to know that you ordered post-it notes. Like I just to say like you want to focus on like kind of the most important details that like help us understand your contributions and impact. Also, always try and put the action first. Sometimes there's a tendency to, in a bullet point, say like, selected as one of 3 candidates for this kind of experience for which I designed a module series. Put the action first. Say, designed module series, comma, as one of 3 people selected as fellows. So always kind of foregrounding the action is important, because otherwise, like once again, like the reader needs to know the most important details first. Getting specific whenever possible, including the specifics about the nature and extent of your responsibilities. If you say like wrote a policy paper, as a reader, I'd want to know like on what, how was it used? Like did your senator then like use the policy brief to inform their kind of position on something? So always thinking about, is there a way of providing the reader with insight into how something I did was used, what kind of impact it had. If so, try and include that. So like the focus on kind of like the results, like what it did, like why it was important. Use active verbs. I mentioned this at the end of the last workshop, but Wellesley College has an amazing handout on active verbs for resume. You can just Google Wellesley College active verbs resumes, and you will find a list divided into categories of like leader, like management kind of experience. The reason I would highly encourage you to like download that list and use it whenever possible is because words like helped, assisted, worked, and participated in do not tell me anything. Like, I don't know. I like walk away from helped. I'm like, if you said like helped plan a conference, as a reader, I would think like, well, did you come up with the conference theme? Did you invite speakers? Or when you say helped, did you just like run a couple errands for the conference organizers? Like helped can mean a huge array of things. So you want to get as specific as possible with like, and precise with the verbs that you're choosing to use. Edit and proofread. I think this hopefully goes without saying, but take care with your resume just as you would with like another kind of aspect of your application materials, because it is representing you and you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. Something that like, I don't know if a lot of people know, but like resumes should always be like full pages. Don't do like a page and a quarter. It just like looks like it's not complete. Either like use like 1 page or do like 2 pages. It shouldn't be it shouldn't be more than 2 pages for this kind of experience. But yeah, like don't do like half pages, and don't go crazy with the formatting. Like I don't want to, a resume should never be narrower than like 0.5 margins and like 10-point font. Like never go like super crazy. Like use kind of like standard fonts. Don't do like, you know, cursive, not that you would, but like don't go super crazy. You don't need to include pictures on your resumes. I think there's like the new trend to like people include pictures on resumes. Like you don't need to do that. Like we're just doing kind of like the standard resume for this kind of situation. Don'ts, I said, don't avoid weak verbs. Don't be redundant. You don't need to list out all of the courses that you've taken on your resume because your transcript will show that. As I mentioned, don't get crazy with the formatting. Avoid the temptation to use adjectives. Like sometimes I've seen people do things like brilliantly organized conference. Like you don't need to add those kinds of adjectives. Just lay out the information, let the person make their own kind of conclusions about what was happening. And don't inflate your achievements and pretend that you did way more than you did, but also make sure that you're owning up to like your kind of contributions. So there's that nice balance there. Okay. And then I just kind of like want to have my inspiration. So as I mentioned, like my son was born exactly a year ago. So this is my baby son, Sam. And just want to say, regardless of what happens, like, and I mentioned this in the email that I want to send out, like you are doing a great thing just by putting together an application and submitting it and like putting yourself out there and like taking stock of your achievements. That's amazing. And I'm so pleased and hopeful that you actually like do that. And we'll be very proud of you when you like submit your application, regardless of what the outcome is. Once again, there are going to be more people who apply than are selected to move forward. But as I hope I've emphasized, and I hope that you also realize like this experience can be translated to other spaces. And regardless, like you keep doing like the work that you're doing great work. Like use this as an opportunity to think about like what other kind of opportunities can you seize that will enable you to delve deeper into kind of your issue area, explore it from different angles, and think about like how to maximize the remaining time of your kind of like time at Georgetown to kind of like prepare yourself to do this work like moving forward after Georgetown. So that's the final kind of like reflection piece. Any final questions? Oh shoot, I went up to like, I said I was going to end early. Well, I will hang out for a little bit longer here. If anybody has questions, let me stop recording.